Every time Vladimir Putin does something the West didn't predict, the same cycle plays out. Analysts call it irrational. Politicians call it miscalculation. Intelligence agencies quietly update their threat assessments, and then, a few months later, Putin does the next thing they didn't predict, and the cycle repeats. Georgia in 2008, Crimea in 2014, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the expansion of Russian influence into Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. Each move described as a surprise. Each move, in hindsight, entirely consistent with everything the man has been saying publicly for over 2 decades. The problem isn't that Putin is unpredictable. The problem is that the West keeps trying to understand him through a framework he doesn't operate in. Western foreign policy assumes that rational actors want the same things: stability, economic integration, a seat at the table of the international order. It assumes that the logic of trade, investment, and mutual benefit is universal. And it assumes that when a leader acts against those incentives, something must have gone wrong. A miscalculation, a psychological break, a domestic pressure he couldn't control. But Putin isn't miscalculating, he's executing. And until the West understands what he is actually executing toward, it will keep being surprised. This is the hero complex, and it is the most important thing about Vladimir Putin that the Western foreign policy establishment still refuses to take seriously. To understand the hero complex, you have to start where Putin starts. Not in 2022, not in 2014. You have to go to 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed in December of that year, and with it went something that tens of millions of Russians experienced not as liberation, but as humiliation. An empire that had stretched across 11 time zones, that had launched the first satellite and the first human into space, that had defeated Nazi Germany at a cost of over 27 million lives. Gone, dissolved, replaced by 15 separate republics, a Russia that was economically shattered, and a decade of chaos so severe that male life expectancy dropped by 6 years. Putin has called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. That line is almost always quoted in the West to make him sound delusional or dangerous, but in Russia, it wasn't controversial. It reflected a lived experience that a huge portion of the Russian population shared. The 1990s in Russia were not a hopeful democratic transition. They were a period of mass poverty, criminal privatization, and national degradation so acute that it produced a word, demokratia, a Russian slang term combining democracy with a word meaning filth. Putin rose to power out of that rubble, and from the very beginning, he was clear about what he intended to do with it. The West made a critical error in the early Putin years. It looked at the rhetoric and heard authoritarianism. What it missed was the theology underneath it. Putin is not simply a strong man protecting his own power. He is a man with a specific civilizational mission, one that he has articulated consistently in speeches, in essays, and in policy decisions for over 20 years. And that mission has a historical template. He has cited Peter the Great repeatedly and publicly as a model, not just as an admirer would cite a historical figure, but as someone drawing a direct parallel. In 2022, just months after the invasion of Ukraine, he stood in front of an exhibition on Peter the Great and said explicitly that Peter hadn't conquered the lands to the west. He had taken back what was historically Russian. And then Putin said, "It seems it has also fallen to us to take back what is ours." He was talking about Ukraine, but he was also saying something larger. He was saying that he sees himself as operating in the same historical tradition as the rulers who built Russia into a continental empire. Not a president managing a nation-state within the existing international order. A historical figure restoring what was lost. That is the hero complex, and it is not a psychological quirk. It is a coherent worldview with deep roots in Russian intellectual and political tradition. There is a strain of Russian thought called Eurasianism, and it has shaped Putin's worldview more than any Western analyst has been willing to seriously engage with. The core idea is this: Russia is not a European nation that failed to modernize. Russia is a distinct civilization, Eurasian in character, Orthodox Christian in spiritual foundation, imperial in historical destiny. And its natural state is not a medium-sized nation-state squeezed between NATO and China. Its natural state is an empire, a civilizational pole, a counterweight to the West. The philosopher Alexander Dugin, often called Putin's brain, has articulated this framework in exhaustive detail for decades. The specifics of Dugin's influence are debated, but the broader framework is not. Russian state television, Russian foreign policy language, and Putin's own speeches all reflect a version of this civilizational thinking. The idea that Russia is not simply a country among countries, but the center of a distinct world that must resist absorption into the Western liberal order. From inside this framework, NATO expansion is not just a security threat, it is an existential, civilizational assault. The West absorbing the buffer zone that separates Russia from the forces that would dissolve its identity. Ukraine is not just a neighboring country with a right to self-determination. It is, in this worldview, an artificial construct carved out of historical Russian civilization, and its absorption into the Western sphere is equivalent to amputation. You don't have to agree with any of that to understand that this is how Putin thinks, and the West's refusal to engage with this framework seriously, its insistence on reducing Putin to a gangster, a kleptocrat, a simple authoritarian protecting his money, has made Western policy responses consistently late, consistently underpowered, and consistently shocking to the people making them when they fail. Here is what the misreading looks like in practice. When Putin annexed Crimea in 2014, the Western response was built on the assumption that economic sanctions would change his calculus. The logic was straightforward. Russia was integrated into the global economy. It needed Western markets, Western investment, and Western financial infrastructure. Apply enough economic pain, and the rational actor at the top would adjust course. What happened instead was that Russia accelerated its de-dollarization efforts, deepened its pivot toward China, built alternative payment systems, and expanded its agricultural sector to reduce dependency on Western food imports. By the time the far more severe sanctions of 2022 were applied following the full invasion of Ukraine, Russia had spent 8 years specifically preparing for them. The Russian economy contracted sharply in 2022. GDP fell by roughly 2.1%. But it rebounded faster than almost every Western forecast predicted, growing by 3.6% in 2023 and an estimated 3.2% in 2024, outpacing most of Western Europe. The IMF, not an institution given to flattering authoritarian governments, repeatedly revised its Russia forecasts upward. None of this means Russia is thriving. Military spending has consumed an enormous share of the budget, estimated at over 40% of government expenditure in 2024, the highest since the Soviet era. Inflation has surged. The demographic cost of the war is severe and will compound for decades. But the point is that the sanctions strategy was built on a model of Putin as a rational economic actor who would respond to economic pain by moderating his ambitions. And that model was wrong from the beginning, because Putin's hierarchy of values does not place economic comfort above historical restoration. He has said this explicitly. The West just hasn't believed him. The hero complex also explains something that puzzles Western observers endlessly. Why does Putin seem so comfortable with isolation? Western leaders operate within systems that require constant approval, from voters, from allies, from markets, from media. Their decisions are constrained by the next election cycle, the next quarterly GDP figure, the next opinion poll. The idea of voluntarily making your country an international pariah for the sake of a territorial goal most economists say isn't worth the cost is genuinely incomprehensible to people operating inside that system. But Putin is not operating inside that system. He is operating inside a different timeline entirely. Peter the Great ruled for 43 years, Ivan the Terrible for 37, Stalin for nearly 30. These are the figures Putin references, consciously or not, when he thinks about what it means to reshape a nation. The hero in Russian historical tradition is not the leader who kept the economy growing and the approval ratings high. The hero is the leader who endured suffering, who imposed suffering, in service of a transformation that only future generations would fully appreciate. This is why the isolation doesn't register as failure for Putin the way it would for a Western leader. Isolation, in this framework, is evidence that Russia is fighting for something real, something threatening enough to the existing order that the existing order is trying to crush it. The sanctions, the diplomatic expulsions, the ICC arrest warrant, these are not signals that he has gone too far. They are confirmation that he is going in exactly the right direction. The West has also consistently misread the domestic dimension of the hero complex. Western analysis has long predicted that the economic pain of the war would eventually translate into political pressure that would constrain or remove Putin. That Russians would eventually tire of the casualties, the inflation, the isolation, and demand accountability. And while there is genuine opposition, the protests that followed Alexei Navalny's death in 2024 were real, and the courage of people who took to the streets in Russia under those conditions deserves recognition. The overall political dynamic inside Russia has not moved in the direction Western analysts predicted. Part of the reason is repression. That's real, and it matters. But repression alone doesn't explain the genuine support Putin retains, particularly among older Russians and those outside major cities. That support is rooted in exactly the narrative we've been discussing. The sense that Russia is under siege, that the West has always wanted to keep Russia down, that 1991 was a humiliation, and someone is finally fighting back. The war in Ukraine, framed inside Russia not as an invasion, but as a defensive operation against Western encirclement, lands very differently on people who lived through the 1990s and still feel the wound of what that decade did to their country. Polling in authoritarian states is inherently unreliable, but the structure of the domestic politics is not. Putin's hero narrative isn't just something he believes. It is something a significant portion of the Russian public has internalized, because the historical grievances it draws on are real grievances, even if the remedies being pursued are catastrophic. So what does all of this mean going forward? If the West continues to misread Putin as a rational actor who can be deterred purely through economic and diplomatic costs, it will continue to be surprised. Because the hero doesn't stop when it gets expensive. The hero stops when the mission is complete, or when the hero is gone. The mission, as Putin has articulated it, is the restoration of Russia as a great power that cannot be ignored, humiliated, or absorbed by the Western order. Ukraine is a central piece of that mission, but it is not the whole of it. The expansion of Russian influence into Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Libya, Syria, and Venezuela is not random opportunism. It is the methodical construction of a counterweight, a demonstration that Russia can project power globally even as it fights a land war in Europe, and that the Western order is not the only order available to countries that feel excluded from it. That strategy has found more traction than Western observers want to admit. 9 African countries have expelled French military forces since 2020 and moved toward Russian partnerships. The Wagner Group, now rebranded after Prigozhin's death but functionally continuous, operates across a vast stretch of Africa with no sign of retreating. And the BRICS framework, once dismissed as a talking shop, has expanded to include Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, Egypt, and Ethiopia, representing a combined GDP that now rivals the G7. Putin didn't build all of that, but he positioned Russia to benefit from all of it. That is not the work of someone who miscalculates. That is the work of someone executing a long-term vision with patience and consistency that the West, locked inside its electoral cycles and quarterly thinking, has repeatedly failed to match. Here is the hardest truth in all of this. The West is not wrong that Putin is dangerous. It is not wrong that the invasion of Ukraine is a war crime. It is not wrong that the system he has built inside Russia is authoritarian, corrupt, and brutal toward dissent. All of that is true, and none of it should be softened or excused. But being right about those things is not the same as having a strategy. And the West does not currently have a strategy. It has a reaction. It responds to each move after the move is made, applies the tools available within its own political and economic framework, and then expresses surprise when those tools don't change a calculation that was never built on the assumptions those tools are designed to exploit. Understanding the hero complex is not sympathy for Putin. It is the basic intelligence work that effective opposition requires. You cannot counter a strategy you refuse to understand. You cannot design deterrence against a man whose hierarchy of values you keep misreading. And you cannot negotiate an end to a conflict if you don't understand what the other side considers victory. Putin is not the last Soviet. He is not simply a gangster protecting a criminal enterprise. He is something the West has not had to seriously contend with in a long time. A leader who genuinely believes he is a historical figure, operating on a historical timescale, pursuing a mission that supersedes the normal cost-benefit logic of modern statecraft. The last time the West faced something like that, it took a world war to resolve it. That should be enough reason to start taking the hero complex seriously before the next move that nobody predicted.